Hello, welcome to the EURACTIV's Disinformation series. Today I have a great pleasure and honor to talk to Juliane von Reppert-Bismarck, creator of Lie Detectors, an award-winning news literacy project in Europe. Welcome.
Thank you, Karolina, for the very nice invitation.
You used to be a member of the advisory high-level expert groups advising European Commission on fake news, disinformation, and media literacy. You have advised policymakers and governments on anti-radicalization and platform accountability. Now, please advise us, our readers, our viewers, our listeners, on how to fight disinformation. And so let's begin from the very beginning. How's disinformation a problem?
Yes, so thank you very much for placing such an important accent on this topic. Like you, we've been worried about disinformation for a long time. And what we've seen very simply is that, particularly now during the pandemic, unchecked and viral disinformation working to undermine trust in basic facts, trust these days in science, and this really working to undermine the ability of citizens to make simple, informed decisions. And with that, undermining the very basis of the democratic process and democratic society, which after all relies upon the ability of citizens to make informed decisions. And Lie Detectors, as you said, is an independent media literacy organization. We work with professional journalists to tackle disinformation and its corrosive effect on democracy. And we do that by sending journalists into classrooms via video conferencing these days during the pandemic to speak with young people and their teachers on how to tell apart fiction online from facts, how to understand how journalism actually works, and by advocating at international level for smart policies.
Sounds like an incredibly important project, especially nowadays. So the post-truth era started with the fragmentation of traditional news sources and proliferation of social media. What do you consider the greatest threat of disinformation?
Well, there are many threats. And as I said, the main threat is to democracy. The problem is that the longer we work on this, the longer we see that disinformation continues to adapt, proliferate, and thereby confound even the most experienced fact checkers. We have been relying for a long time on fact checkers and content moderators to delete and eradicate our way out of this problem. But disinformation is really evading detection by moving onto those encrypted spaces that we increasingly use to inform ourselves, those image and video-based platforms that are owned often by the largest and most powerful platforms. I'm talking about Instagram, YouTube, also TikTok, and increasingly gaming websites and platforms such as Twitch or Discord. And this is where people are increasingly gravitating to inform themselves. And with very realistic recourse to alternatives, users can stay trapped in a cycle of providing data to the platform's algorithms, and this in turn then exacerbates the reach and the effect of disinformation. So we're really in a little bit of a vicious cycle which needs to be broken, and broken fast.
So generally from this interview, I'd like to learn from you how to stop this vicious circle. But maybe first I will ask how the EU is trying to stop it, how disinformation is affecting the EU, and how does the EU respond, and can it do more, and how exactly?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the European Union is in the good position of having a variety of tools at its disposal. How does disinformation affect the EU? Well, disinformation affects all democratic institutions, and that doesn't stop short of the European Union. Disinformation is based on very powerful incentives of money and of political power. We know that foreign powers continue to subvert democratic processes via manipulative campaigns. And disinformation really does need to be tackled quickly and from a variety of angles. So we think about this in terms of the supply perspective and the demand perspective. I will concentrate perhaps a little on the supply perspective. This really means holding to account the drivers of disinformation through smart use of EU and international tools. By that I mean enforcing data privacy standards, deploying new and existing antitrust tools, really reining in the collection of behavioral data that's such an integral part of the business of outrage and the business of polarization. And the EU is currently working, as you know, with drafts of the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the European Democracy Action Plan, the Code of Practice, and these really present an extraordinary opportunity to get this done. Now, the Commission, as you know, has condemned repeatedly the large platforms' non-adherence to the EU Code of Practice that was put in place a few years ago. And this has really highlighted that self-regulation is going to fail when a business model that is built on trapping users and stoking outrage is at stake. The basis of solutions must lie, therefore, in taking on information at its source. That means taking on the business model and taking on those elements that monetize lies, as the Commission itself has called it recently. So following the money and applying existing and new antitrust principles is a fundamental avenue for securing European democracy at this stage.
Thank you. How might we then reshape media literacy using emerging technologies that you were talking about and online tools in order to interact with citizens of all ages for their resilience?
Yes, and this very much goes to the other perspective that we have to tackle, and that is the demand perspective. Disinformation exists and becomes viral because there is a demand for it. And while we cannot expect citizens to do all the work, and we do need governments and policymakers and regulators to step in, there's also something that can be done from the point of view of citizens' resilience. And there we call for three separate acts in the field of media literacy. First, we call for critical media literacy to become an integral part of all school curricula and also of all teacher training curricula, so that all teachers, regardless of the subject area, whether they are teaching maths or biology, ethics, whether they're teaching young people, whether they're doing further education, can address this issue with their students without qualms or worries. Second, we call for increased investment in media literacy and in teacher training so that the independence of this training is really guaranteed. And that's a very important issue that worries the teaching profession at the moment quite a lot. Fundamentally, we call for media literacy to be considered a core literacy alongside basic literacies like reading, writing, and counting. An additional literacy, the fourth literacy that needs to be added to this, is the ability to check a fact. And that should be reflected at the OECD level, at UNESCO level, and all the way down to the regional and local level.
Very concrete recommendations. And how could the news ecosystem be reshaped to better fit the citizens' attitudes, habits, and approaches so that they don't turn to malign misinformation sources?
That's a very good question. So we do see that young people really aren't on those text-based traditional platforms that we consider to be news carriers, such as Facebook or Twitter. Young media users are focused on visual news sources, image and video-based news sources. These can be very, very difficult to moderate. And newsrooms around the world have actually begun adapting to this reality already. It is important that the brand recognition remains so that there is a way for checking sources even when you're just watching a video. And given the oversupply of information, this deluge of news, there's also value in peer assessment among quality media. The New York Times does something very interesting here in that when it comes to very high interest news stories, they showcase news coverage and also opinion coverage from across the political media spectrum, as long as it is credible and reliably sourced. So they make space for diverging views, but do actually pinpoint what they consider to be quality and well-researched media.
So let's maybe now come back to training for a moment and look into your practical toolkit. So what are some of the good practices that you use to help school children and young people improve their media literacy and recognize dis and misinformation?
So we work with mainly 10 to 15-year-olds, but we have also adapted our work to working with teachers and even working with adults and even senior citizens. There are various points of best practice that we have identified and that organizations that work in our field have also identified. And that is one very important thing, is to keep in mind an interactive approach when you are talking about media literacy. This is not about a top-down teaching. This is the only way that you can actually ensure that we remain relevant and that media literacy begins and continues to address existing problems in a really rapidly evolving media landscape where diverging news exposure is created by algorithms and people have very different experiences of what is going on in the world. So it's got to be interactive. It's got to be questions based. Second, we teach children very basic journalistic methods. We really have in mind that everyone should have these journalistic methods to hand, and that is the ability to check a source, the ability to check multiple sources. It's what the OECD calls multi-source literacy, to evaluate the value of the different sources and to build knowledge based on that. We also teach the children to think about the context in which images might be appearing, checking the date. It's quite simple. We teach them something which they really love, which is the reverse image search, which is a little technical trick, which can be quite fun to do. And one very important thing also is we really consider it's important to discuss the fact that disinformation exists because there is a demand for it, and also to discuss the issue of confirmation bias, particularly at a time of a pandemic when people are in crisis and people are in need. It can be very easy to reach for disinformation that presents an easy solution or an easy answer to very complicated questions. So finally, one very important thing also is that we work with examples that are not always political. So it can't always be about refugee policy or religious tolerance when we're talking about media literacy and news literacy. We work with examples that are as simple as, is this post true that shows a man marrying his pet cobra? Or, what about this photo of a shark that's been photoshopped into the wrong context? So it's really very important to stay light, to stay non-political when you're trying to affect change on a very broad level. Because if you make it too political, you really do risk alienating adults who hold strong opinions already. And it also risks becoming irrelevant to young people who might just put this down as a problem for adults that does not affect them. At the very beginning and at the very core, media literacy has got to be about a very simple flexing of the critical thinking muscle and an understanding of why there is a value in understanding the difference between fake posts, straight news, and opinion. And everything else must come from that starting point.
I like this new kind of fitness of flexing critical thinking muscle. Thank you for this recommendation. Okay, let's now anchor our talk more in the pandemic. Because of the current health crisis related to COVID, our lives have shifted greatly. Our screen time has soared. How has this shift into digital life affected our consumption of information? Has it affected our ability to distinguish between fake news and the truth and made us more vulnerable, or nothing has changed?
So these days we go into classrooms via video conferencing because we can't walk in as we used to do. And what we see when we see the children on the screen is they line up and they ask questions to the journalist, and they will have prepared questions. And among those questions are things like, they will literally say, is it true that the virus was made in a lab on purpose and that it was released on purpose? Is it true that wearing a mask makes me less safe. And then they will also say, what shall I do if I receive an email from my aunt telling me to circulate news that Bill Gates is trying to get all of us microchipped? So yes, there is confusion. And what we see is there's also a growing presence of conspiracy theories. And this is a new phenomenon, which is worrying, because when you think about it, conspiracy theories really are the ultimate deepfake with multiple layers of distortion. The good news is that people really are interested, possibly more interested than they have ever been. The pandemic has really made this topic more widely and extremely relevant.
And finally, before Lie Detectors, you were an award-winning journalist writing for the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Reuters, Spiegel Online, and many others. What, in your view, is the role of traditional media and journalists in fighting disinformation?
So we see that journalists really must occupy a central role in disinformation, and also in speaking to other communities about media literacy and how to go about this do-it-yourself model of tracking disinformation. They also must continue, obviously, high quality and independent reporting, which is tricky at a time when the business model is under pressure. The European Commission's European Democracy Action Plan has recognized this, both in the accent that they've placed on media pluralism, but also by actively supporting journalists' work to promote media literacy. And we welcome this very much. We work with more than 250 journalists in 4 countries. And these journalists tell us very frequently that fighting disinformation in this very hands-on way and promoting media literacy is one of the fundamental things they feel they have to do to secure the sustainable of the work that they do, of the journalism that they do.
On behalf of EURACTIV Poland, I would like to totally agree with that. So thank you, Juliane. It was a great pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Karolina.
And goodbye.
Bye-bye.